What legal steps are necessary for a landlord to take if rental property burns in a fire? And this happens, so fires, floods, other things which are referred to in the property code as casualty loss are addressed in the property code itself. And so the code essentially measures this by the extent of the damage. If the property is, for all intents and purposes, a 100% total loss, then either side, the landlord or the tenant, can issue written notice to the other and say, I'm terminating this lease. We're essentially done. And the tenant would only be on the hook for rent up until the date of their move out. So with a fire, it's pretty easy for them to move out if 100% or most of their things were destroyed in the fire. And so upon move out, they're entitled to a pro rata share of their upfront paid rent. But sometimes the casualty loss is different. And the tenant sometimes can remain on the property, even though for all intents and purposes the entire property is lost. Floods operate this way, especially if it's a two-story home. If you don't have access to the bottom floor, the kitchen, the living room, all of that is essentially destroyed. But you do have access to the top. The fact that you can get down, from the stairs and the top is okay, doesn't mean that there isn't a dangerous condition on the bottom floor that renders the entire house uninhabitable. And so in this case, you still have a tenant who's got stuff upstairs, and they are entitled to a pro rata refund of their prepaid rent, but only as of the date that they move. If you have a tenant who's living on a piece of property where, for all intents and purposes, the property has been destroyed through a casualty loss, flood or fire are the most common ones, then again, you can issue a written notice to that tenant and it terminates the lease. You can then, through your insurance company, come in and make repairs. If it's a total tear down or a lengthy rehab, you can go ahead and make those repairs and then re-let the property once those repairs are done. But essentially it comes down to notice. Now, what happens if the property is only half unusable? And this happens sometimes where, let's say the fire is not so extensive that it destroyed the entire house. Let's say, for example, it was in the kitchen, but it was controlled and it destroyed the kitchen and maybe part of the living room, so that a significant portion is damaged, but the tenant can still reside on the property. Well, in this case, you can work out a deal while you and the tenant are in the process of, or while you are in the process of rehabilitating the home. You and the tenant may work out some diminished value of rent because they're going to have less access to the property. They can still sleep there. They can still use 80 or 70% of the property, but that 20 or 30% that is rendered unusable, it would be fair for you and the tenant to renegotiate terms in the interim. But essentially the lease is still in place. If you're in month 2 of a 12-month lease, they don't get out because the premises is partially unusable. Again, in this case, it would require some work between you and your tenant to make sure that the repairs are done in a diligent manner, which is always the responsibility of the landlord. But the tenant doesn't get an automatic out. Again, you can kind of meet them part way and adjust the rent during that interim while the repairs are being completed. And once the repairs are completed, you can resume back on the original rent terms for the full amount of rent. And so this is another good reason why it's great for tenants to purchase their own renter's insurance, so that their personal property that's lost, which is not guaranteed by you, the landlord, their personal property that's lost can be recovered in their own insurance claim while you take care of the structural damage, which is your responsibility during a casualty loss. Now, one other small detail in both the working with the tenant to maybe renegotiate interim terms of rent owed during repairs, and then terminating outright a lease when a casualty loss renders an entire home uninhabitable. Landlords, as always, we welcome you to follow us on our Instagram page. If you're not a member yet, join us on Facebook. And if you enjoy what you see here, give us a thumbs up. Click that like button. We enjoy that very much. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please consider subscribing. The last consideration is whether the tenant had fault. Because the property code allows one of these two options depending on the extent of the damage, only if the tenant or one of the tenant's guests had nothing to do with it. If it was truly some accident that was caused by the wiring, or perhaps a lightning strike, or in the event of a flood or a hurricane, it's 100% weather related, then yes, nobody's at fault at that point, and you go through the normal mechanisms of insurance, and in a 100% loss, the tenant has an out. In a partial loss, you and the tenant can negotiate while the repairs are being done. But if that tenant is responsible for the damage, then you could effectively terminate the lease based on that damage. And so, again, if it's caused by nature, or it's caused by some unforeseen problem that has nothing to do with use or negligence on the part of the tenant, then yes, normal insurance steps in, and one of these two options is available. But if it's caused by the tenant, you probably want to get rid of a tenant who is going to bring harm to your property. Okay, well, we've got a question that just popped up here about covering hotel losses. That again is a subject for the renter's insurance. If they have an insurance policy that otherwise would compensate them for that, remember, if the loss is 100%, then you just automatically terminate the lease, and you don't owe hotel stays at all. It's a complete loss. It's an unfortunate thing, but you get to terminate the lease, and your obligation to the tenant is zero. You may, as part of the refund of the prepaid rent, offer to give them the balance of the prepaid rent for that month. So, for example, if it happens today, December 13th, and they prepaid to the end of the month, and the house is gone, then you could refund the money, and then they could pay to stay in some other place. But the lease is terminated, and your obligation to that tenant are terminated. Could they have a claim against you? Potentially, if you somehow are found to be at fault, but that's a different topic than whether or not through just a normal loss you would owe them a hotel stay, and you just don't. And I know this issue comes up a lot, especially with water issues, right? Busted pipes, that sort of thing. The house is flooded, and people need a place to stay, and so they say, well, you owe me a place, and so I'm going to go get a hotel. I'll send you the bill. Well, again, if there's a casualty loss that causes partial damage, you can talk about diminished value for the rent, but as far as owing them a hotel stay, that's just not true. If again, they've lost 20% access, and they think that the other 80% is, although otherwise completely usable, not good enough, they're entitled to stay in a hotel. But if they still have access to 80% of the property, then really you're only talking about a diminished value of about 20%, and at most maybe a renegotiation. And the truth is that the property code doesn't require that renegotiation. It encourages it, and it could ultimately prevent a lawsuit. And so I encourage landlords to have that conversation. But as far as automatically doling out for a hotel, again, it's not something that you are absolutely required to do. It might be something you choose to do, but again, your lease doesn't require it of you, nor does the property code.